They call it a family, a sanctuary woven with smiles, but blood is not what binds these hollow walls. It is pure leverage. The environment is meticulously designed to mimic warmth and safety, a psychological incubator engineered to lower the primal defenses of the unsuspecting prey. Observe the orchestrator of this grand illusion. He stands tall with an impeccably tailored suit, casting a shadow that devours the room. His face wears a permanent hollow smile, but meticulously crafted from years of emotional commerce, designed exclusively to disarm. Every gesture is a calibrated performance. The gentle pat on the shoulder is never an act of affection, but an assessment of structural compliance. Enter the chosen subject. The ambitious worker drowning beneath a towering sea of paperwork, their posture already screaming quiet submission and fear, desperate for approval. They wear wrinkled clothes and carry the heavy, crushing burden of unyielding loyalty. Their tired eyes reflect a desperate hunger for validation within this artificial tribe. The manipulator gracefully approaches with a cup of coffee, a trivial, almost worthless crimson token, handed down as if it were a sacred artifact, demanding absolute gratitude. This is the hidden architecture of a psychological snare. The exhausted victim gratefully accepts the warm beverage, entirely unaware they have just swallowed the first invisible hook. In a healthy ecosystem, a contract defines the boundary of labor. In this engineered nightmare, the very concept of a boundary is deliberately treated as an act of treason. The term family is weaponized to rewrite the rules of engagement. It replaces legal obligations with emotional debts, ensuring the ledger never balances or favors the worker, always enriching the house. Notice how the long shadows in the room stretch and violently contort. The sterile fluorescent lights buzz menacingly above, reflecting the silent, agonizing reality of the trapped. The victim smiles back, offering a fragile and utterly exhausted expression. They genuinely believe they have found a true home, oblivious to the invisible strings attaching to their limbs, one by one. The deceptive facade is now perfectly and completely cemented. The naive prey feels entirely secure inside the crushing jaws of the predator, mistaking the incredibly sharp teeth for a protective fence. A transaction is never an adoption. The working hours have officially concluded. But for the engineered family, the real shift has only just begun, extending into the shadows. The victim retreats to what should be a sanctuary, a private space to heal the mind, to rebuild the boundaries that the day ruthlessly tore down. But the boundaries are no longer physical. They are digital, immediate, and inescapable, waiting silently in the dark for a single vibration. A late-night message disguised as casual care, a simple question about a minor detail, wrapped in the terrifying expectation of an instant reply. The heart rate spikes immediately. The victim hesitates, staring at the glowing screen, feeling the crushing weight of an unspoken obligation tightening around their chest. To ignore it is to set a boundary. But setting a boundary in a cult of devotion is instantly framed by the manipulator as an act of profound betrayal. So they type a response, fast, polite, eager to please. In that brief, seemingly harmless moment, the first invisible chain is permanently locked. Across the void, the manipulator observes the instantaneous compliance. It was never about the work. It was purely a test, to measure the erosion of autonomy. Boundary erosion does not happen with a violent crash. It drips slowly, quietly, until the victim no longer recognizes where they end and the company begins. By morning, the exhaustion is visibly deeper. The victim gave away their rest for nothing, yet feels a sick, twisted sense of pride for being utterly indispensable. The manipulator approaches, offering a subtle nod of approval, a dangerous dopamine hit, reinforcing the destructive behavior and ensuring it happens again. Midnight messages gradually transform from rare exceptions into an absolute standard. The victim's personal life is consumed, digested piece by the insatiable machine. The psychological cage shrinks with every compromised weekend and interrupted evening, until the walls are so incredibly tight, breathing becomes a luxury. They do not own your time because they bought it. They own it because you, slowly, willingly, and tragically, handed over the keys. The boundary is erased. The private self is dead. Sacrifice is a truly noble word, especially when it is carefully forced upon someone else entirely. The naive worker approaches the altar of management. They carry a simple, legally bound request, hoping for a brief moment of long overdue rest. Watch closely how the predator receives the document. There is no immediate rejection, only a long, heavy sigh designed to instigate immediate guilt. He does not say no. Instead, he speaks of collective hardship, painting a fabricated crisis to make them feel deeply and profoundly selfish. The concept of a team is brilliantly weaponized. The manipulator shifts the heavy burden, placing the entire weight of failure directly onto their shoulders. If you leave now, who will carry the load? The question is a psychological trap, meticulously engineered to paralyze them with overwhelming moral dread. The right to rest is suddenly transformed into a betrayal. The paper in their hand suddenly feels like a burning confession of absolute corporate treason. True manipulation leaves no visible fingerprints. The most effective prison guards are the ones who convince the inmates to forge their own locks. Observe the exact moment the will breaks. The victim lowers their head in shame, slowly withdrawing the very request they desperately needed to survive. The orchestrator offers a warm, paternal smile of approval, a devastatingly cheap reward, given only when the prey chooses to starve themselves completely. They call it taking one for the team. But in this parasitical ecosystem, the only entity that truly feeds is the insatiable corporate machine. The leave application is quietly shredded into the abyss. Another personal boundary crumbles, silently paving the dark road toward an inevitable, crushing psychological collapse. They return to their desk, heavier and more hollow. They have sacrificed their health, believing it was a deposit into a non-existent emotional bank account. The family narrative has successfully overridden the legal contract. The predator now knows this subject will gladly bleed out before ever asking for a bandage. A willing sacrifice is still an execution. Guilt is the absolute cheapest currency on earth, and the predator prints it out endlessly to fund their growing empire. To keep the dedicated laborer cheap and compliant, they must believe that demanding their worth is fundamentally and deeply immoral. The psychological tactic always begins in a communal setting, designed to project a fake illusion of severe organizational distress. The manipulator artificially lowers their voice to a whisper, sharing fake struggles to bypass the brain and strike the heart. Notice the extremely calculated use of the word "we," a trick to make the corporate parasite look like a victim. The exhausted employee, naturally wired for genuine empathy, absorbs this fake crisis as a personal and urgently critical responsibility. When an individual finally asks for a well-deserved raise, they do not ever evaluate the numbers. They merely attack the timing. How can you ask for more right now? The rhetorical question is fired like a bullet aimed directly at their fragile conscience. Instantly, a profound wave of unearned shame hits. The victim feels like a selfish scavenger, trying to steal from a desperate, starving, and dying family. The reality of the corporate profit margins is completely hidden. The victim is heavily gaslit, forced to witness a mirage of impending, collective financial doom. The manipulator sighs, playing the wounded martyr perfectly. They shift the narrative seamlessly, forcing them to apologize for seeking basic, human survival needs. This is the true, devastating power of weaponized guilt. It is an invisible prison, where the inmate proudly locks the door and destroys the key. They return to the endless grind, working infinitely harder. They abandon their financial rights, fueled by the illusion of rescuing the noble, sinking ship. The orchestrator watches quietly from the high, darkened tower.
Everything is mine.
The ledger balances perfectly, because the tax was paid entirely by the most vulnerable. A highly profitable tragedy always requires a willing martyr. They crown the utterly exhausted as glorious heroes, solely to ensure the rest will gladly die trying. Behold, the employee of the month. They are propped up like a fragile mannequin, completely drained of their blood, yet forced to continuously smile. The employee of the month is merely a psychological tool, a warning disguised perfectly as a highly coveted grand prize. To normalize severe physical destruction, the predator must publicly celebrate it, framing dangerous exhaustion entirely as a supreme act of loyalty. Sleep deprivation becomes a badge of profound corporate honor. The bags under their eyes are treated as prestigious medals earned on the sacred battlefield. Meanwhile, those who fiercely protect their basic human boundaries are silently pushed entirely into the cold, unforgiving dark shadows. The manipulator orchestrates this division with absolute precision. They cast the healthy individual as a highly toxic traitor to the struggling corporate family. Fear of being labeled a traitor is a powerful motivator. The victim watches, terrified of being brutally exiled from the only tribe they know. The standard is no longer defined by simple, honest productivity. It is measured entirely by how much agonizing pain the subject is willing to endure. They sit at their desk long past midnight, completely hollow. They are not working. They are performing a desperate ritual of corporate self-flagellation. The pedestal is intentionally designed to be dangerously narrow, forcing the desperate victims to continuously push each other off. This creates a brilliant self-sustaining loop of endless labor. The predator never has to crack the whip because the subjects eagerly bleed to prove their supreme worth. They hold up their cheap certificate of recognition. It is nothing more than a receipt confirming they have successfully sold every ounce of their soul. To stand on the burnout pedestal is a fatal victory. The higher they climb this dark ladder, the harder and faster they will inevitably shatter upon impact. A golden crown of chains is still a heavy prison. The sheer volume of required labor is completely and mathematically impossible. Yet they frame it almost entirely as a simple time management flaw. The victim is drowning beneath an absolute avalanche of moving targets. They sprint constantly on a treadmill, only to find the finish line is deliberately moving backward. When the inevitable physical collapse finally happens, the predator strikes. They do not yell or throw things. They simply observe the utter failure with quiet, disappointed silence. They tilt their head with an expression of fake concern, softly asking why the simplest daily tasks are suddenly taking you so incredibly long. The foundation of reality begins to crack. Gaslighting is a highly sophisticated weapon, designed exclusively to make the victim deeply distrust their own sanity. They casually erase the original instructions right in front of the victim, confidently rewriting the very core memory of what was initially agreed upon. Am I going crazy? The terrifying question loops endlessly in their tired mind as they desperately search for logic inside a deliberately rigged maze. The terrifying label of being inefficient is carefully injected into the psyche, spreading like a highly toxic venom, paralyzing any remaining critical thought. Once they believe the problem is entirely internal, the trap snaps shut. They stop looking outward at the abuse and turn the magnifying glass directly upon themselves. They profusely apologize for their own entirely fabricated and manufactured weakness, desperately begging for one more chance to drag the impossible heavy burden. The manipulator absorbs this apology like fine, aged wine. The gaslighting is totally complete. The laborer has been transformed entirely into their own ruthless supervisor. By completely shifting the blame, the company avoids accountability forever. The toxic environment remains invisible, protected fiercely and desperately by the very people it destroys. Every impossible deadline is a hammer. Every fake expression of disappointment is another cold, heavy nail driven straight into their self-worth. The employee works furiously through the pain, blind to the manipulation. They are entirely convinced that if they simply run faster, the brutal abuse will magically stop. When the mind breaks, reality belongs strictly to the abuser. A fabricated crisis always demands their entire soul, which is eventually rewarded with a miserably cheap slice of cold pizza. Trauma bonding is the most sinister psychological weapon. The predator first creates the agonizing pain, just so they can briefly play the glorious and benevolent savior. The manufactured emergency violently strikes the quiet office. The victim is instantly thrown into pure panic, drowning rapidly beneath the crushing weight of impossible corporate expectations. Notice the highly orchestrated chaos around the prey. The environment itself is violently weaponized, designed to break down their natural defenses, entirely and completely. Adrenaline floods their exhausted and severely broken system. They desperately look for any safe harbor, completely blind to the terrifying fact that the predator owns the storm. Just as the victim reaches their absolute breaking point, the orchestrator finally steps out from the shadows, offering a pathetic token of fake affection to stop the artificial bleeding. It is never a genuine act of mercy. It is a carefully measured dose of dopamine injected directly into a completely shattered nervous system to breed absolute compliance. The exhausted mind deeply craves any positive reinforcement. They mistake the sudden cessation of abuse for an act of profound and beautiful, unconditional parental love. A trivial reward is treated like a holy artifact, the red glow of the cheap token, completely blinding them to the incredibly heavy chains wrapped tightly around their neck. This is the precise moment the terrifying bond solidifies. The victim is no longer just working, they are desperately chasing the next chemical high, provided by their own abuser. The cycle of intense terror and pathetic relief repeats. Each rotation makes the invisible cage stronger, until the very concept of a life outside becomes a deeply terrifying nightmare. They will fiercely defend the very monster who tortures them. The Stockholm Syndrome is fully active, transforming the abused worker into a highly devoted and fiercely loyal corporate soldier. The manipulator watches the psychological addiction take full effect. They hold the absolute power of life, deciding exactly when the desperate and starving prey is allowed to finally eat. The trap is now sealed with a chemical lock. The victim will never attempt to leave, because the predator has successfully convinced them that the poison is the only cure. Starvation makes the cheapest bread taste like a royal feast. The human body always keeps the score, meticulously recording every debt before it, eventually demands full payment. The engineered adrenaline inevitably runs completely dry. The victim sits utterly paralyzed, staring blankly as their cognitive functions violently begin to shut down. Artificial stimulants can no longer mask the damage. The heart beats dangerously fast, while the mind slowly sinks into a heavy and terrifying dark abyss. The corporate machine does not recognize biological limits. Another impossible task is dropped, casually demanding the very last drop of their rapidly draining life force. They attempt to reach for the familiar guilt, desperately trying to ignite the engine with a spark that is dead. But sheer willpower cannot negotiate with total organ failure. The heavy, invisible chains suddenly become violently and painfully real, anchoring them to the floor. In a healthy ecosystem, a collapse triggers immediate rescue. In this engineered nightmare, the sudden silence is entirely deafening, as everyone looks the other way. The orchestrator observes the malfunction from a safe distance. There is absolutely no pity, only the cold calculation of a deeply disrupted and broken production line. The beautiful illusion of a loving family evaporates instantly. The warm and comforting mask shatters to reveal the terrifying truth of a purely transactional meat grinder. I gave them everything I had to give. The thought echoes endlessly, completely bouncing off the cold, hard walls of their self-made solitary confinement. The predator is already quietly surveying the open room, expertly looking for the next naive and highly energetic, ambitious young target. A broken tool cannot be successfully manipulated with guilt. When the leverage completely vanishes, the victim becomes entirely and utterly invisible to the cold corporate eye. There is no dramatic final confrontation or loud explosion. The psychological break is silent, a quiet and devastating internal collapse that leaves the physical shell empty. The hands on the ticking clock finally stop moving. The desperate and frantic sprinting comes to a sudden absolute halt on the infinite dark treadmill. When the gears grind to a violent halt, the family portrait is swiftly cropped. The discard phase is executed with terrifying speed, erasing years of profound loyalty in a single, cold, empty afternoon. There is no emotional farewell or warm embrace. The transaction is instantly finalized with a cold and heavily stamped, stark white legal termination document. They gather their meager belongings in complete silence, staring blankly at the cardboard box that holds their entirely wasted youth. The orchestrator does not even bother to look. Their eyes are already intensely scanning for the next naive, energetic target. The empty chair does not remain cold for long. Another ambitious and energetic soul is immediately guided gently toward the exact same dark, deadly trap. A broken cog holds absolutely no sentimental value. It is simply ejected from the machine and left to completely rust alone in the dark, cold, empty void. The long walk down the sterile corporate hallway feels like a silent funeral procession for a completely murdered and stolen identity. They cross the threshold of the invisible prison. The heavy door smoothly clicks shut, severing the toxic psychological trauma bond with terrifying absolute and cold finality. Outside the walls, the sudden silence is deafening. Without the constant adrenaline of abuse, they feel completely and utterly invisible to the surrounding normal world. Back inside, the digital footprints are rapidly deleted. The victim's name is erased completely, as if they never even existed within these hollow corporate walls. The fresh recruit sits at the haunted desk, completely oblivious to the lingering ghosts and the heavy, invisible iron chains. The predator gracefully approaches with a warm smile. A trivial crimson cup of coffee is handed down exactly just like a sacred and holy divine artifact. The trap resets with flawless and terrifying precision. The massive machine requires constant blood to keep the giant gears turning at maximum possible output efficiency. The discarded worker looks back at the building. The glowing red neon family sign now clearly looks exactly just like the jaws of a starving monster. The hardest truth is not the sudden discard. It is realizing you were completely replaceable from the very first working day. A contract is a simple transaction of time. It was never a legal certificate of binding familial adoption. The corporate entity is a perfectly engineered machine. It has no heartbeat, no genuine empathy, and absolutely zero capacity for true human emotional warmth. Every smile, every compliment, every late-night pizza was simply a calculated mathematical investment designed to extract maximum yield. They happily rent your professional skills daily, but they absolutely do not legally own your eternal human soul. True loyalty is a highly precious resource. Do not ever blindly pour it into an incredibly deep, bottomless pit. Setting a strict boundary is not an act of betrayal. It is the profound biological instinct to survive the psychological slaughter. The anger they show when you leave is simply the loud frustration of losing a very cheap, reliable resource. You are not abandoning your beloved family. You are finally breaking out of a highly toxic holding cell. The psychological scars will undoubtedly remain for a long time, but clarity is entirely worth the heavy pain of withdrawal. Do not mourn the loss of them, because a beautifully constructed corporate parasite is absolutely never your real home. The massive gears will keep turning forever, but they will have to violently grind, entirely without your own blood. Your time, your health, your ultimate sanity. These are the only absolute currencies that you genuinely, truly own. Never trade them for a fake plastic trophy. Never burn yourself down simply to warm and utterly cold corporation. Remember this absolute truth tomorrow morning. A corporate entity is just a machine, and you are completely free. Run.